Put your hands together. Vaishnavi Patel.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here. My name is Vaishnavi Patel. I'm the author of Kaikeyi. I'm a little shook right now. It's my debut novel. It came out today and my parents are here. So that's amazing. And it means a lot to me because Kaikeyi is based off of the stories that I heard as a kid growing up in an Indian Hindu household. It's the big Indian epic. One of them is called the Ramayana, and it tells the story of Ram, who is a prince of this great kingdom and a god reincarnated on earth, and how he's exiled from his kingdom just as he's about to take the throne and goes on a 14-year journey in order to cleanse the world of evil, essentially. And Kaikeyi in that story is basically the evil stepmother. She exiles Ram, setting off his entire journey. And when I was young and I was hearing the stories, I remember at one point my mom broke in and she said something to the effect of, how can Kaikeyi be evil when without her, the world wouldn't have been cleansed of injustice? She's the one who kicks off this entire journey and is the cause of the entire epic. And that stuck with me for literal decades until I started law school and I found myself thinking of this character again and starting to research her and think about her origins and what might have made her exile one of her sons who she's seen and raised from birth. So Kaikeyi is really an exploration of those questions and the bits of history that I uncovered along the way. And I'm really excited to do a small reading and then maybe do some Q&A. But before I start the reading, I want to give a little explanation of the section I want to talk about, because it's the first scene I ever wrote. So I wrote this book kind of out of order because you'll see that this scene starts on like page 125. And it's a big battle scene where Kaikeyi rides out into battle with her husband to try to beat a warlord named Sambarasur. And it sort of shows who she is as a person because it shows her sort of taking charge, being in a place where women aren't supposed to be, and making her own thing out of it and using her own skills, which are different from the skills of many other people on the battlefield, to win the war and save her husband. And I am very excited to share it with you. So, can you all hear me okay? Are you good? Okay. And somebody asked what page it was on if you wanted to follow along, and it's on, I'm going to start on page 125. So to set the scene, she's on the battlefield. We're about halfway through the battle, but they still haven't found their target, who is this warlord. And so she's realizing that unless she finds him and they take care of him, the war won't be won. And she's the charioteer for her husband at this time. And her husband's name is Dashrath. That's probably helpful. Dashrath's men were gaining the upper hand, and the field was scattered with broken chariots. For several moments, my focus was fully directed to navigating around the dead and the dying. It was almost frightening how quickly I had acclimated to the suffering. I lifted my gaze once more, sweeping across the battlefield, and something caught my eye. I flicked the reins, pushing the horses to move more quickly, and a standard came fully into view. It was the enemy's, embroidered with the snarling face of a tiger, but dyed in a deep green that made it stand apart. Sambarasur. We raced toward him, and I knew that Dashrath immediately understood my plan. He loosed an arrow at Sambarasur that barely missed when the enemy's charioteer swerved at exactly the right moment. We careened toward each other, and just as I put Dashrath within spear range of Sambarasur, our opponent hurled his own with a triumphant cry. The spear glanced off one of our wheels with a crack, and the horses reared in fear as the chariot came to a bone-shuddering halt. I do not think it would be arrogant to say that with my driving, Dashrath's chariot itself had become a brutal weapon. Sambarasur had not been trying to kill us, not yet. He had been trying to stop us. "Get down," I cried, all decorum lost in the face of danger. I crouched low as the horse's hooves churned the ground. "I'm not a coward," he called back. He drew his kunda with a rasp of steel. "Get down," I repeated, but he was a Raja, under no obligation to listen to his charioteer, or his wife. Sambarasur's chariot raced toward us. The warlord hefted another spear in his hand, and, with a great cry, sent it soaring through the air. Time seemed to slow, then came rushing back far too quickly as the weapon pierced Dashrath's chest. "Never take your eyes off the enemy," Yudhajit's voice cried in my ears, so I did not turn to help him. Instead, as Sambarasur drew closer, preparing to finish us, I pulled off my helmet for a better view of the whole field. I could see his eyes now and watched with a grim sense of satisfaction as they widened in surprise. A woman charioteer was not a common sight. And then he made his last mistake. He hesitated. "Take the opening," Yudhajit said, but I did not need his advice. Holding the reins of the horses firmly in my left hand, I reached behind me and grabbed the smooth wooden shaft of one of Dashrath's mighty spears. Relying on instinct, on the muscle memory of years of old lessons, I adjusted my grasp on the haft, finding the center of gravity. I threw, my breath rushing out of me in a shout. By the time obsidian-tipped death found Sambarasur, piercing his neck and shoulder in a deadly blow, I had jumped down from my injured husband's chariot to examine the damage, conscious it was our only form of escape. My hands shook as I examined the smashed wheel, 2 spokes broken, the whole thing fallen off its axis. Steel clanged behind me, the shouts of fighters mixing with the cries of dying men. My magic could not help me now. "Indra, please," I whispered, desperate. Indra was the god of charioteers and had long been considered a protector of Kosala. Perhaps he would help me to save a favored Raja. Guide my hand. No inspiration struck me. Maybe the gods were punishing me for joining the fight after all. And Dashrath? He might already be dead. I grabbed the bottom of the wheel and tugged with all my strength, trying to push it back into place. My shoulder blade pressed back into the splintered spoke. I strained with the effort, eyes clenched shut, until a battle cry sounded too near for comfort. "Never take your eyes off the enemy." I opened my eyes as the wheel popped back into place. A soldier lunged toward me, sword ready, and I rolled out of the way. He buried his blade into the earth as I swung myself back into the charioteer's seat. If only Yudhajit could see me now. He would laugh and call me as agile as a monkey for clambering back up so quickly. I spared a moment of gratitude for my brother's words, for they had kept me alive. Then I snapped the horses into motion, barely hearing the soldiers scream beneath the wheels as I carved a path away from the battlefield, my mind fixed firmly on my husband. Dashrath troops parted for me like he on a warm summer day. An observant rider outstripped me, racing back to camp to prepare them for our arrival. In the broken chariot, it took us several precious minutes in which I felt as though with every breath I was the one bleeding, and not my husband. If he died in a chariot I drove into battle, they might as well put me on the pyre with him. I pulled up into the middle of camp and healers swarmed us before I'd completely stopped. "Is he alive?" I asked, leaping into the dirt, uncaring of who might witness my unwomanly behavior. Not that it mattered, because nobody so much as looked at me. Their chattering overlapped into an undecipherable din. I slipped into the binding plane and studied the fragile ties binding me to the men around me. The threads were thin, brittle, and dull besides, as though I was trapped in an aged wheel. Magic would not work. Is my husband alive? I made each word ring like metal blades. The Raja's retinue all turned to me with varying expressions of confusion, contempt, and horror. A small man next to Dashrath's prone form nodded. "Yes, Radni, he still draws breath." The work resumed, but now the advisors encircled me. "What happened?" one demanded. Sambarasur cracked one of the chariot's wheels, and in the ensuing confusion, his spear struck true. Skepticism radiated through each on the binding plane. And where is Sambarasur now? This voice I knew, Virendra, the Minister of War. He was Dashrath's favorite advisor. He shouldered his way into the circle. The string between us was orange, made thicker than the rest through familiarity, although I knew that did not mean much. Dead, I said, turning to face him. The Raja slew him before succumbing to his wounds. The lie was easy. It felt as though I had prepared my whole life to tell it. Their discussion subsided as they stared. How did you escape? Another asked. I jumped down from the chariot and pushed the wheel back into place, I said, and then I brought him here immediately. In the corner of my eye, I saw the healers lift the Raja onto a hammock and carry him off to another tent. I thought his arm moved, but perhaps that was simply the jostling motion. You? The advisor said, pulling my attention back. He looked me up and down, just as Asha had that morning, but whereas I felt at ease under Asha's gaze, under his I felt disgusting. His mouth pulled into a slight grimace. How could you fix the wheel of a war chariot? I prayed to Indra, and he guided my hand. Another lie, the only one that would quiet them, for of course the gods would assist in saving their beloved Raja. Accepting that as truth, they turned away from me and followed Dashrath into the tent. Thank you. So that's all I have prepared for reading, but I would love to have a conversation or answer questions or anything you might be curious about. So I hope you have questions. Yeah?
How did you pick this myth and this character to retell the story of?
Yeah, so I have been fascinated with Kaikeyi's character specifically for a very long time, ever since I heard her story growing up, because she is such just a classic villain archetype of the evil stepmother, the seductress who sort of had her way with her husband and now he has no choice but to follow what she says. But before that point in the myth, you got a couple of glimpses of her. This chariot scene, for example, is based on the truth. She, when early in her marriage, does save her husband's life on the battlefield. She does grow up with 7 brothers. She is well loved and well respected, and she's in some ways led into this by her servant, Manthara, who is also a character in this book. So I was really interested in exploring why somebody like that, who seemed to have so many positive qualities, would then sort of turn and do something purely motivated out of jealousy. I really wanted to tell her story and have her actions have some other explanation beyond just pure jealousy, so that even though she is still a flawed character who does make mistakes and is in some ways responsible for what ends up happening, it's a lot more sympathetic and understandable from how she gets to point A to point B. Yeah?
So, from like a perspective of somebody who might not be as familiar with the original myth that this is based off of, can you kind of explain like a little bit about the original story and then how somebody might approach this book best if they're coming from that perspective?
Absolutely. So I cannot do as good of a job as my grandma, who is the one who told me these stories, but I will try my best to give a condensed and abridged version. So Dashrath, who is the king of Kosala and Ayodhya, has 4 sons. One of them is Ram, who is also the god Vishnu reincarnated on Earth. He also has another son by Kaikeyi, and 2 twins by a 3rd wife. So years pass, they're all happy growing up. Ram has many adventures and slays demons. Even in his youth, he's very special, and everyone in the kingdom can tell that he in particular is special. He can protect them. He has already saved them many times over. And so when the time comes, Dashrath decides that he is going to pass on the crown to Ram. And when he makes this decision, Kaikeyi's maidservant goes to Kaikeyi and tells her that if Ram becomes king, you're going to lose your position. Kaushalya, another queen, is going to become queen mother. Everyone will, respect her. Your own son will be forgotten. You have 2 boons, which are basically like free wishes that have been given to you by the king for your valor. You should use them to put your son on the throne. And she's like, yeah, you have a point. My son is getting the short end of the stick. And in some versions of the myth, her son has actually been promised the throne. And so she goes to the king and she demands that with her first wish that he put her son on the throne instead, and with the second wish that he exile Ram for 14 years into the forest. And Ram, being a very loving and obedient son, understands that his father has made this promise already and can't go back on his word. So he, along with his wife Sita and his brother Lakshman, goes into the forest for 14 years. So they're living in the forest in exile for several years when this demon king, Ravan, finds that Sita is there. He has wanted her for a long time, ever since when she was getting married and choosing her husband. He was one of the competitors in that contest, and he decides for various reasons that he's going to kidnap her and take her to his kingdom in Lanka. So he succeeds in kidnapping her. He distracts Ram and Lakshman. He comes to her as sort of a penitent asking for alms, and she, being a very gracious person, is going to grant them, and then he grabs her and takes her to Lanka. And of course Ram decides to follow and free her from captivity. So Ram and Lakshman travel across ancient India. They meet Hanuman, who is a god who is a monkey god, and eventually they make it to Lanka. They fight this great battle, and ultimately Ram kills Ravan, frees Sita, and takes her back home to the kingdom, where his brother gladly gives the throne back to him, and he takes his rightful place in the throne. And then in some versions of the myth, after that, there's sort of an epilogue in which people in the kingdom question Sita's purity after having lived with another man, and because of that, Ram decides that he can't have a wife whose sort of purity is in question, even though he believes her. So he exiles her, and turns out she's pregnant, and she has twins while she's in exile in the forest, who he eventually finds, and then they come back and take over the kingdom. So that's sort of the very, very condensed version. I'm sure I missed a lot. My mom's sitting in the back, I'm sure, has corrections for me. But Kaikeyi in all of this is there in the very beginning of the story. She exiles Ram, she kicks him out of the kingdom, and then that's sort of where her story ends. Supposedly, when she comes back, she asks for his forgiveness, and he gives it to her, like she's repented that she did this, but that's in some versions and not in some versions. But really, her main role is sort of this jealous stepmother who exiles him. And where Kaikeyi fits in the tradition is it follows almost all of these plot points. I mean, you do meet a younger Ravan, and there's some things that are changed, but in the end, I'm sorry, this is kind of a spoiler for a 3,000-year-old myth, Ram still gets exiled because of Kaikeyi. That's sort of what happens, and the way that you get there is very different. And because you're in her head, it's a first-person perspective, you're seeing the things that she finds important, you're seeing the interactions that she finds important, and what her concerns are about Ram. I've tried to just flip that story on its head, so you have the same plot points, but an entirely different internal motivation on how you get there. And so that's sort of where that fits into the tradition of retellings. So that was a very long Ramayana crash course. Yeah?
Your book has gotten so much press, and I just all sorts of people are interested in it. But I'm just wondering, when you were writing, did you imagine a particular kind of audience, a particular kind of reader?
Kind of. So when I started writing this, it was first semester of law school, and I was going home at night, and I was just really looking in some ways for a creative outlet, and I was fascinated by the story, so I started writing. And at that time, I had no thought in my head that this is going to get published, that I'm now a second semester 3L, so I'm at the very end of my law school journey and getting published, and I'd never imagined that that was going to be the end point of this journey. But when I started thinking about and pursuing publication, I think my first sort of audience that I felt like I was really writing to, or like more like revising for, were other people who grew up with this myth, and other people who really cared about this myth, but maybe were concerned by some of the more troubling aspects of it, or questioning the role of patriarchy in these myths, and wanted some other story or explanation, because that's kind of who I am as a reader and what I was looking for at the time that I started writing it. And so I was writing for myself, but for that broader category. But I hope that readers of all types enjoy Kaikeyi, and I think in particular, if you like seeing different depictions of feminism and how feminism interacts with myth and religion, I think that's sort of broadly who I would say that this book appeals to. But I mean, I imagine maybe there's somebody out there, but I don't think any debut author sits there and writes and is like, and somebody will put this in the New York Times. That was an extremely, extremely surreal moment that I'm still not entirely sure happened. It could have just all been a dream.
I really appreciate your book, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for writing it and hosting this event. I have a quick question about the what motivated or what decisions went into the choices you made about Kaikeyi's sexuality, because I had noted that it was a very deliberate and intentional choice, so I was just curious what went into that.
Yeah, so Kaikeyi in the book is asexual, but there's not really the vocabulary at the time to say that. But in many ways, I mean, I think that needs more representation. I wanted that to be there, but I also think that Kaikeyi falls into the seductress archetype. Like, if you think about evil women in books, they often either fall into like the seductress who is like using her body to get what she wants, or they're like an old crone who's like ugly and rejected, and I think those are both really troubling archetypes for a variety of reasons. But in particular, Kaikeyi is often depicted as the seductress, and her servant is depicted as the old crone, and together they tag team to do a lot of mischief. And I didn't want her to be thinking about that or using that. There's so many other relationships that matter to her. She is so much more than just her body and her sexuality. And so I think that really defies some of the ways that she's been portrayed as like really consciously thinking about and using sex and sexuality. It's just not even a factor for her here. So you can see all of the other things that lead her to become who she is and make the decisions that she does. And I hope that it makes all of her friendships and other familial relationships able to be more foregrounded, because the romantic relationship is less present. Yeah?
So you talked about hearing these stories passed down from your grandma and your mom, and in your dedication you also dedicated the book to 3 generations of strong women. So I wanted to know, what was it like introducing this book to the women in your life, to the people who originally told you these stories?
Yeah, so the book is dedicated to my grandma, my mom, and my little sister, who is not here, but is basically the reason that this book exists, because she read every single draft of this book. And I was really nervous, especially giving it to my grandma, who told me all these stories when I was a kid, and really is what set me down this path. And I was nervous both because I wanted her to like it, I really wanted her to have a good time, and also because there is some religious critique in here, and while it's also religion I was raised in, I have a lot of love and respect for it, it's about change, and it's not everyone's cup of tea, and I understand that. So I was a little bit nervous about that, but she loved it. She was so excited about it. She literally did a photo shoot with my book after she finished it. And so it was really rewarding to get to kind of tell her a story after she had told me stories for like 10 years of my life. Yeah.
More than 10 years of your
You're embarrassing me. Thank you for the correction.
Even in high school.
I.
When she came, you would be like, yeah, please tell us.
Is this strictly necessary?
As a first-time author and a student in law school, which is incredibly impressive, what was your writing process like for this book?
My writing process is a little chaotic. So I draft pretty quickly. Like once I start getting in drafting mode, I write every single day until the draft is finished. But because of law school, I've tragically for my sleep schedule trained myself to only be able to write after 8 p.m. So I have to like wait until 8 p.m. hits and then I start drafting until I feel done for the day. But yeah, I think I draft really consistently and I draft without chapters. So I just keep going in one continuous narrative with scene breaks, and then afterwards I do a very heavy revision process because I've just been dumping my thoughts out for 3 months. And so the first pass of revisions is like fixing all of the plot holes that I've created and like making sure that the characters have the same name throughout the book because they did not in the first draft, and adding chapters and all of that. And then I think what really works for me is I have periods where I don't write. So I'll write for like 3-4 months straight, and then for the next month I won't write at all. Like maybe I'll revise, but I'll read a lot, I'll focus on law school, I'll refill like my creative well, so that I can draft again later. I think writing every day or consistently works really well for some people, but I think trying to balance law school and writing, I found that like the really focus on writing, really focus on other things, really focus on writing, really focus on other things works well for me and allows me to like get out the full story that I have in my head and then let it sit, do something else, not be writing every day, so that when I come back to it I'm really itching to start writing again. Sort of building that up really helps.
Was there a character besides Kaikeyi in the book that was your favorite to write or reimagine?
So one of my favorite characters in the book is Yutajit, who is Kaikeyi's twin brother, and he's there from the beginning to the end. They have a rocky relationship, there's a lot of ups and downs, and I think I really enjoyed writing him for 2 reasons. First, I have a younger sister and a younger cousin brother who I'm very close to, and so sibling relationships are just really important to me, and getting to write one, even if it was different from my relationship with my siblings, was just so much fun. But also because I think some part of the book is about his journey towards understanding and accepting Kaikeyi for who she is, and how hard that is when she's sticking out in a world where women don't take on these roles, and how much, even though he loves her, he messes up and he does wrong by her sometimes, and she does wrong by him sometimes, because they're trapped in this system that isn't good for anybody, and because they have to work within it, it causes all of this tension. So I found that really fun and interesting to write. But I think that the character that almost everybody who's read an early copy has told me is their favorite is Kaushalya, who is the first queen of Ayodhya. So she's Dashrath's first wife. She's already there when Kaikeyi gets there, and at first they have a bit of a standoffish relationship, but then they become really close. They have a really nice relationship, and they're, best friends. And I think people have enjoyed that, and I enjoyed writing it because so often you see this trope where multiple women are interested in or even with the same man, and they are fighting each other and hating each other and really petty. And instead of that, these 3 women who are all his wives basically become like sisters to one another, and they're working together and they love each other. And I think that was really fun to write an alternate take on that trope.
You brought this up, and I was going to ask that anyway, but Kaushalya is my favorite character. But one thing that did really stick out to me in the book was, like you said, the relationships between Kaikeyi and Vaishnavi and the other queens, but also her relationships with other women, her servants, Mantra, Asha. why was it so important to you, you know, not just to retell Kaikeyi's perspective, but to also give all of these other women their own stories and their own space, and have them also be important to Kaikeyi's journey?
Yeah, I think that was really important to me when I was drafting, was to have a rich cast of female characters and to show all of their different lives and perspectives as much as is possible when you're seeing the story through Kaikeyi's eyes. And I think that's because this book is about Kaikeyi's struggle with the patriarchy in her society in many ways, and it's about her realizing that at first she thinks it's like just about her and just about getting to do the things that she sees men doing, and then over time she realizes it's about so much more than that, and it's about the ways that women as a group are treated, and also the way that the individual women in her life have so many strengths and so many things to offer that sort of go unrealized. And so exploring all these other characters was kind of a way to illustrate that. And also I just have fun writing women being friends. I think it's really interesting, and they all have different interplays, and I have so many good female friends in my life, and so it was fun to like draw on the aspects of their personalities or their interplays to write this. If I have like one small regret about this book, it's that Sita is only in it at the very end, and her voice isn't explored as much. She's only in a few scenes, and in part that's because when you're seeing everything through Kaikeyi's eyes, she doesn't have as much of a say. Sita is Ram's wife, but she's sort of the main female character in the original Ramayana, and she's not around as much, or her character is less developed, and I wish that there had been space in this, 500-page chunker to add a couple more scenes of Sita.
I'm not sure how much you can say if this is going to be like a spoiler, but I was just very curious around some of the decisions you made around Rama, and how he was portrayed, his personality, and I guess, and I remember you said that you yourself are religious, so I was just wondering personally what that took to make some of those decisions. I personally love the personalization. I think also embedded within that is a critique itself of a lot of both mythology and scripture, I guess, within Hinduism, so I actually really appreciate it, but I was wondering personally what it took to put forward that type of depiction.
I think, I've talked a lot about this with my editor Priyanka, who's also Indian, who also grew up with these stories, and also cares a lot about how Ram is portrayed. And without going into spoilers, I think I can say a few things. One is that I hope that in this book, especially in the second half of it, you get to see Ram's character from a kid who doesn't really know any better and is being strongly influenced by potentially bad influences in his life, to somebody who ends up being able to think for himself and ends up in a place where I think he's a much better person. But a lot of the character inspiration was actually drawn from just making a little more extreme what I think are his flaws in the original epic. Because in the original epic, he exiles his wife because he cares so much about public opinion and what other people are saying about him and his wife. And so in this story, as a kid, he's also making some bad decisions because he cares so much about the opinions of other men in his life, and is because of that valuing some opinions of people who are perhaps very strongly pro-patriarchy over the opinions of, say, his family members, because he really wants to impress or satisfy them. And I think that also speaks a bit, I think, to how even today you see that sometimes young men can end up with these really odd and radical positions that are hard to understand when you think about their families, who are perfectly lovely and have pretty normal views on society, but they're getting radicalized by their peers or by internet forums where people are claiming to be experts and explaining why the world is the way that it is, or why they're struggling with the things that they're struggling with. And because they're really easily influenced at that age, or don't understand the full implications of what they're subscribing to, they end up in these really toxic thought patterns. And so I kind of drew on that, but my goal was to end up in the very end, perhaps not until the epilogue, but by the end, with a Ram that is closer to the Ram of the epic, who has been able to sort of think through his actions and maybe make choices that his peers wouldn't have wanted him to make, but he wants to make them for himself and think more freely. And I don't think I can say any more than that without getting into spoilers, but it was a hard line to walk, and while I feel satisfied with where Ram's character ended up, I know that not everybody is satisfied or is going to be satisfied because he is this religious figure. However, I think that we have to be able to critique our religion or our beliefs in order to make them stronger. If it can't stand up to critique, then I don't think it was that strong to begin with. But if you can critique it and poke at the parts that are weak, you can build something stronger. And I don't think the entire Ramayana collapses if you poke at the patriarchy bits. I think it's still an excellent story about important values and morals and duty and fate, but we can talk about those aspects and still understand that some of it is difficult or a product of its times that we don't want to necessarily carry forward. That was a very cryptic answer, I think.
I got you.
Okay.
Any more questions? I think for the last question, a favorite of ours here at RJ Julia is, what are you reading now?
So I'm actually reading a nonfiction book called Legacy of Violence by Carolyn Elkins. I think I saw it on your shelf actually, so if I pitch this book well, maybe somebody will pick it up. But I am really fascinated by colonialism and imperialist history, and I've been honestly playing around with this project involving colonialism in India for a while, and I picked this book up because it's about how the British Empire specifically used state-sponsored violence and terrorism to maintain control of its colonies, and how they slowly escalated it and tried to legitimate it through the legal system, which is very fascinating to me personally because I'm a law student. And it's, it's hefty, it's like 800 pages, but it's, so far, I'm 100 pages in, I am loving it, I've tabbed it all up. It's really fascinating. I mean, I like to study this period, I think I know a lot about it, but some of this stuff, even I'm absolutely shocked by. Yeah, I don't want to keep talking about this book, because I could literally give you a summary of the first 100 pages, I'm loving it so much.
Thank you very much.